Thank you so much for coming out. I know it is a very rainy and end of the week and all of that sort of thing, but I have been excited about the opportunity to come to Hue-Man ever since I found out that there was going to be this chance to present the book in this particular environment. So what I'll do is try to take as little time as possible, actually, to present some of the main ideas of the book, just so you know what kind of project it is. And then I would like to just kind of open it up for conversation. And I'm happy to talk about questions from the book or to talk about sort of American politics more broadly, because I know that many of you may know me much better from my sort of public role than from my academic role. So this book, Sister Citizen, is a long time coming, it feels like. I've been doing a lot of press lately about the book, and people keep saying, why did you write this book now? And I said, I didn't write this book now. I've been writing this book for a really, really long time, and I just happened to manage to finally finish it and get it published now. But it's a book where I had the very, very first ideas about it a decade ago, longer ago now than that. The very first data that I collected for this book was around 2000, and I'll tell you the very, very first thing that ever inspired me to think about it was watching a commercial, and I want to say it was a United Way or some other sort of PSA commercial, and in it they had an African-American girl running through a sort of, typical, as we would see presented on television, black urban ghetto. Who knows what neighborhood it was, and she's going past, trash heaps and, streets with the windows are broken and there's people standing on the corner. And the voiceover comes and says something like, every day Kiana has to run past drug dealers and this sort of thing on her way to school and home. Run, Kiana, run. And it was kind of this celebration of what a powerful little girl Kiana is, that she could manage to get to school and home under these tough circumstances. And my first thought was, I'm sorry, could we help Kiana out? Could we make Kiana's neighborhood a neighborhood that she would not have to run through in order to go back and forth from home to school? And it was in those first thoughts about how we often celebrate the resilience of African American girls and women in these difficult circumstances, so much so that we can sometimes get blinded to doing the political and social work of cleaning their circumstances up so that they would not have to be so strong and so resilient in the first place. So those were the very first sort of initial stirrings of this project, and it's changed form a lot. When I first started writing the book, it was a book about resource disparities, all the things that black women don't have, about our disparities in health and how we're more likely to die of a whole variety of diseases and conditions than our white sisters. It was a book about our economic circumstances and how little wealth we have and how much debt we have, how many fewer educational opportunities we have. It was a book about a long history of those resource disparities and all of the political and social work that we've done trying to close some of those gaps. And then August 29th, 2005 happened. August 29th, 2005 is the day that the levees failed in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And it changed the book. I threw away about 2/3 of what I'd written, and well, I didn't quite throw it away, I just moved it into another file. so there may yet be a book project there. But as I watched what was happening in that post-Katrina moment, resources mattered. Resource disparities were incredibly important. Class was important, poverty was important. But in the work and research and conversations and analysis post-Katrina, the main thing that people were telling me was the most painful, the most horrible, the most awful part of the experience was not only the loss of property and the loss of community, but it was the sense that they had been thrown out of the American story. That by being called refugees, by being given one-way tickets away from homes where they had often been in multi-generational communities, by hearing over and over again that their neighborhoods and communities were not worth saving, that they should just be turned into green spaces for environmental reasons, that it was as much that disownership from the American story, this sense of not even being citizens worthy of having communities and homes and lives worth fighting for, And so the book shifted a little bit. It's still a little bit about resource disparities, but mostly it's a book about how it feels to try to do the work of being an American citizen when you're in a black woman's body. It starts, therefore, because of that shift, because Hurricane Katrina changed everything about the book. It changed everything ultimately about my life. 6 years later, I now live and teach in New Orleans. It begins with Zora Neale Hurston, because you will remember that Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God ends with a devastating hurricane. It ends with a hurricane in the Everglades that disrupts Janie's life, right? You know, Zora Neale Hurston has taken us on this path with Janie Mae Crawford over the course of her life. She's gone through multiple husbands and all of this self-identification, and she's finally kind of found a place where she's laboring and she's working hard and she's living in community, and it all gets disrupted by this hurricane. And she actually finds herself, like many of the women in New Orleans, on the roof of her home. She finds herself with her beloved tea cake in a circumstance of racial hierarchy and economic hierarchy, when tea cake is expected to help to bury the white bodies into graves, but those who were black and killed by the hurricane are just laid into mass graves, and quicklime is thrown over them. And then, because her beloved tea cake is bit by a rabid dog in the context of the hurricane, she ultimately loses tea cake as well. So that's where this book begins. This book actually begins with the question of how Zora Neale Hurston's story, the story about one black woman and her sort of search for identity, how that's actually a political story, how it's not just a romance novel, and it's not just a novel as was often written off in her own time by her male peers of the Harlem Renaissance, that she wasn't really doing the work of political commentary. She was just writing about how women feel. And so I try to use Hurston as a way of saying, when we write about how black women feel, we're writing about politics. How we feel is both socially constructed and has social and political meaning. So Hurston is a framework for the book. There's one other framework that I want to offer. And this is my training as a political psychologist. So this is research on cognitive psychology. It's not research on race or gender or class or even on politics. It's research on how our brains work. And the first time I encountered this research, I found it fascinating. It's what we call field dependency studies. And dependency here is not political dependency or economic dependency, and field is not the political field, right? It's literally our visual, perceptual field. What we see and how what we see impacts how we figure out where we are in space. So these are some of the coolest, if you know this cognitive psychology research, are some of the coolest studies you can imagine. They would take a subject into a room, and it was dark, and they'd flip the light on. When the light was flipped on in the room, all of the angles of the room were crooked. So the walls, instead of meeting at 90 degrees, would meet off kilter, and the door jamb would be off kilter, and all of the pictures on the wall would be hung at an angle. Everything around you would be off kilter to a particular angle. And you as a subject would be sitting in a chair, like if you've ever been to Universal Studios, you know those chairs that move, right? Your responsibility as a subject was to find the straight up and down. So everything around you, everything in your perceptual field is off kilter. Your responsibility is to see if you can figure out what is straight up and down. Now, some people are field independent, and despite all these crooked images around them, they're able to find the straight up and down. But most people, the vast majority of us, are field dependent. And when all the stimuli around us tell us that the world is tilted like this, we can tilt ourselves as much as 45 degrees, but experience ourselves perceptually as straight up and down because we're in line with the crooked images. Again, this is not research on race. It's not research on gender. It's not research on politics. But the first time I encountered this, I said, oh, that is just like being a black woman in America, right? This consistent experience of walking around in a room where everything is off kilter, where everything that you expect to meet at 90 degrees is actually meeting at about 62, where that picture looks about right, but you kind of have to do like this to be able to see yourself in it. That the field, the perceptual field for African American women is literally off kilter. And so the claim I make in Sister Citizen is that resource disparity work is real political work. Running for office is real political work. Being on the school board is real political work. But it's also real political work to just try to find one's authentic sense of self